it's really an easy position to be the only academic on the panel, but that's also a good thing for me because I've been studying the Brussels Press Corps, but it ended around 2010, so you are the ones who know how it works now. But today has sort of relieved me that a lot is going on, but the basic challenges have not changed that much. I will try to do briefly just some insights from my research and what I know about the way the EU news machinery is working. And since my background is in political science, I'm obviously interested in the aspect of political journalism and how much it can be adapted or fits with what Brussels has to offer. So let's start with a very basic question that we all know the answer. Is that about politics at all? Of course. But someone mentioned it a few minutes ago. The first reaction could be hell no, because this is the co-decision process. And as a journalist, facing this sort of complex web of tubes through which the decision goes can be really a challenge. But these are riots in Athens after the Troika intervening. So the other aspect is that, well, maybe that really complex decision process has to do, in some respects, with politics, at least for people. And just to sort of, that's a quote I really like. Sorry, it's a bit long. It's from a French newspaper. And the interesting thing is that it could have been published in 2005 during our own referendum campaign. But what's interesting is the actual date of publication. It has been published in 1953. It was when France was about to reject the European Defence Community. And this is a story that we all know about, this classic story of national politicians blaming Brussels for decisions they agreed on, and Brussels blaming on the journalists for not covering adequately EU processes, and journalists blaming the public for not being interested in EU policies. So it's a journalist speaking, actually. So how can we, sort of solve this tension between we have to talk about it, how can we talk about it, and how can we get people involved in the political process? Just some very basic things that everybody knows about, but it's always good to recall. What are EU news? I mean the routine daily EU news. It's a specialized news bit that implies to some degree that journalists have to learn what it's all about, how it's working. It's also a major news place in the world. It has been fluctuating recently, but beginning of the 2000, it was 1,000 correspondents in Brussels, most of them from EU member states. It has dropped to, and it was a concern for the community, to 800, but thanks to the Greek crisis, the things are getting better and people are coming back to Brussels, say, yes, maybe something is happening there that we might be interested in. It's also a niche journalism. Well, at least it has long been a niche journalism in the sense that it concerns a very limited audience. but in a sense it's also a golden niche because, and that has not been mentioned so far, because why general media send correspondents in Brussels? Why do they spend money on this news bit? That also has to do with the kind of audience that is interested in EU news, which is very high profile. Readers and viewers that are not so numerous, but have an obvious interest in terms of advertising potential. When I present to my student what it is to be an EU correspondent, I often say it's a platypus of journalism, a sort of challenge to the law of nature of journalism, which is organized in section, in specialized journalism. And as an EU correspondent, often alone, well, for many media, they are alone to cover the whole EU activity. It's about economy, but it's also about diplomacy, it's also about politics, it's about sometimes about science, energy, agriculture, etc., etc. It's both national and supranational, so it's a real challenge for journalists to transform themselves in this strange animal and not to be ridiculous. I will go really fast on that one because it has also been mentioned. What is newsworthy in Brussels is not always newsworthy at home, and journalists have to fight with the national newsroom to get the story passed. And what their colleagues in Brussels find really interesting might well appear boring in London, Paris, or Stockholm. I like this Norwegian correspondent saying that being a EU correspondent is like describing paint drying, because it was just mentioned. It's slow and nobody knows when it will actually end. I mean, the decision process, who is responsible, who took the decision, where, when, and what were the oppositions. Well, I don't talk about the New York Times, who was concerned by the fact that the number of journalists in Brussels was going down. But I will let the journalist here explain that it's also a very exciting news place for journalists because there are so many sources available. What are the chance to have 28 sources about a single event and sources that you can actually quote? It's really a nice place to be a journalist. It's not an easy one, but I think I have 1 or 2 minutes.
You're fine for a minute or two, yeah.
Oh, so I will leave it with this. If we wonder about the public, the general public, do we face what the Belgian political scientist Paul Magnette has once, he's now in politics, but has once called an Orleanist public sphere? He was referring to this period of French history when monarchy was restored. There were elections, but very few people were actually allowed to get involved in politics. The situation is that we have this an enormous volume of information available about the EU. I mean, if someone wants to know what's going on, it's not that difficult to be informed. But the number of political insiders of the EU is extremely low. And then on the side of the Commission, maybe it has changed, but there was this sort of discourse that if people would actually knew better what they were doing, they would be enthusiastic about what they were doing. This is not really an an historical fact. I mean, I will end up here. In 2005, during the French referendum, the EU has never been so covered, explained, debated, and you know the end of the story. So I don't know what will happen about the UK, but the starting points are different, because in France the yes to the referendum started very high in the surveys and ended up at 46%. And I know that in the UK it's the reverse. So nobody knows what actually a period that is sort of exceptional, where a lot is said about the EU. What will that produce among the British voters? But at least I think it was Simon Hicks saying there are good aspects of this referendum, and I think in France it has, even if EU has disappeared in a way from the top of the agenda, the level of knowledge of people about what the EU is actually doing has increased, and politicians have to take that into account nowadays. So thank you, Olivier.
So my name is Anton LaGuardia. I used to write the Charlemagne column for The Economist, which, as some of you may know, is a weekly column that appeared in the newspaper, and it was focused on European politics sort of writ large. So it was a sort of reserved space, so it was unbelievably privileged. If the FT was the daily must read for people in Brussels, and my column was the supposedly relaxing and perhaps even entertaining column at the end of the week, or so I deceived myself into thinking. Let me just tell you about what a typical day in Brussels looks like, and I'm sort of, this is really a conglomerate of what a day looks like, because I'm sort of going to put several things together. So, you might read the papers and you might read some of the specialist press. You'd certainly read what the FT had to report that morning. And then you would wander into the noon briefing at the European Commission, where you're given these unbelievably plush seats, which is like a cinema, and you could almost go to sleep. And as you walk in, all the journalists are divided into national groups. So the Italians sit on the far right, the Spanish sit right at the front, the French are at the left, the Germans are at the first row of the stalls, the Greeks away at the back. And they kind of wheel out this kind of unbelievably turgid material on, the latest inflation statistics, or perhaps the latest, cost of energy in different parts of the EU, perhaps a sort of turgid new sort of bit of regulation about the pharmaceuticals market. And inevitably, no one really wanted to ask about the agenda being set. Every Commission spokesman had to be present in the front row, able to answer any question from any journalist until everybody was tired of asking them, which made for very long press briefings. The Italians would put their hand up and usually want to ask about something to do with the deficit and how exactly it was being calculated and what exceptions might be made for investments. The Germans would ask about, the morality of European foreign policy, or about subsidiarity. The French would want to know why the briefing wasn't being held in French. The British would ask why is yet more British sovereignty being eroded, or why the Commission is so stupid, or variations of that sort. I always had a problem because I didn't really know where to sit, because my column was, sort of pan-European, and we were a global publication. So sometimes I'd sit with the Brits, sometimes I'd sit with the French, just to sort of even it out a bit. I usually look for the FT to sit next to, and try and understand what the market would think of this event. Then, if it was a day of a European summit, of which there were many in my time, which was a time of the sort of Euro crisis and especially the Greek crisis, you would sit down there chasing each other, interviewing fellow journalists about what they may or may not have heard, having endless cups of coffee. The Belgians would have something stronger, and then at midnight or thereabouts, or sometimes later, the word would go out that the meeting had broken up and we must all depart for our press conferences. It was easy for most journalists to know where to go. They would just go to their particular leader's press conference. And I had to decide whether to go and listen to Cameron's spin or to listen to François Hollande's unbelievably verbose press conferences, or actually go and listen to the person who made the decisions, who was Angela Merkel. So I usually went to listen to Angela Merkel, who sort of rose in my estimation because she always took questions from the foreign press, from the non-German press, I should say, which I thought was always a sign of sort of greatness on her part. And then usually, because she conducted business quite briskly, you could then whip round to the Hollande's press conference because they would be asking him the same question over again. And, you could catch up towards the end of the conference. And in any case, the most interesting part of the Hollande press conference, as it was with Sarkozy, was to stand on the far right, and as the leader is led off by his retinue, he would always stop, and you could have a little off the record with the president to discuss what really happened, and then they would kind of raise their eyebrows about Britain or whatever the problem was. Why do I tell you these two vignettes? Because it tells you two things. One is that reporting the EU is still, for most journalists, a very national business. So it's zero-sum journalism. Did my leader win? Did my leader lose? Was my leader isolated? Was he humiliated? Was she particularly articulate? Did she fight the good fight? Did she keep her promises before she went in? A lot of European leaders have to tell their parliaments what they're going to do before they go into the European summit. Who's telling the truth? You'd have to triangulate. You would normally have to get a sense of what the British, the French, and the Germans were saying before you could get a sense of roughly where the truth lay. And then it was particular business to do with the Greeks, and you'd obviously need to listen to the Greeks and everybody else. So just assembling what happened would take quite a long time at the end of the process, when there really isn't very much time, because it's quite late at night, everybody has deadlines, everybody's rushing around. So, the piece that comes out late on Thursday night might look quite different from something that would be more considered on a Friday morning, depending on how much time you had. The other thing it tells you is that it's very complicated, that it's a very sort of bureaucratic machine. It was, because of its history, as you mentioned, in the 50s, a big issue was whether you would have l'Europe de la défense. And because that failed, they decided to go through a process of integration, through a sort of process of gradual economic integration, very technocratic, very nuts and bolts, very incremental, an exquisite system of checks and balances, so that a particular fight was never quite the decisive battle, because there would always be another round either of the Council of Ministers, or would go to trilogue, or the Commission would be asked to review the system, and so on. The personalities are few and far between, so there are no recognized symbols. Even for a columnist writing a fairly specialized column about Europe, I was always at a disadvantage compared to, say, my Lexington colleague, who would write about American politics. And, when he said the president did this, everyone would know who the president was. And when he said Congress blocked that, everyone would know what Congress was and roughly what its powers were. When I said the European Parliament is involved in a trilogue with the Council of Ministers, I would have to spend, 2 or 3 paragraphs explaining what the process was. So actually, a good 2/3 of my column will be spent just explaining what it is, explaining what the single market is, for example, how it works, how it doesn't work, how everyone's interests have to be balanced. And so you have no recognized symbols, you've got few personalities, you've got very sort of dry subjects, the regulation of chemicals, the nature of, digital copyright, stuff that's actually quite important. It sort of determines our well-being, but makes it extremely difficult to report on any particular day. I think I should leave it there. I just look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much for having me. I think you discover when you work in Brussels and then you leave Brussels how little appetite people have to hear you talk about Brussels and your work in Brussels. So this is sort of cathartic in a way. My experience may be a little bit different from some of the other panelists. I'm American, and I had really no experience of the EU or Brussels before I went there in 2008. In fact, my wife and I had never even set foot in Brussels until we arrived for my assignment. But the FT, which I'm very happy about, but they thought this would be sort of an interesting experiment, perhaps, to have a different perspective on Brussels. I arrived the very weekend that Lehman Brothers was collapsing from New York, and it really felt like I was going the wrong way and leaving a really big story. The early days, I listening to Anton describe the press room and the midday briefing, which is the kind of organizing ritual of the day. But my memories, especially at the beginning, are of being lost to a degree that I don't think I've ever felt quite so at sea. In all of my studies in my professional career, I really had no idea what was going on. It wasn't just the questions I didn't understand, it was the answers. I was utterly lost. And so I think I probably did what most journalists do, which is to take copious notes and try to look thoughtful and hope that eventually it would start to make sense. I discovered, I think, fairly quickly what a difficult proposition Brussels and the EU is for a journalist. There's obviously many things that I think have probably been mentioned already today, but the jargons, the enormous complexity of the institutions, of the political parties, or whether you look at a story through the lens of the member states, or the personal rivalries, on and on and on. And as Anton said, you're often dealing with very technical pieces of legislation, such as various types of agriculture subsidies, and on and on. I think there's another thing which is really at kind of the essence of Brussels for a journalist, which is that Brussels is really a diplomatic city, and the EU is in many ways a diplomatic project, less a political one. And I think there's always a tendency, or there's frequently a tendency in Brussels to kind of minimize any real friction or conflict. So you don't have sort of big political personalities, which journalists love. You have often sort of very competent and capable, but sort of unnamed officials smoothing over any sort of difference. And so it has a kind of natural tendency to kind of suppress the drama. I think over time, all the things that that are sort of maddening for a journalist in Brussels, if you like it, if you don't leave after a year or 18 months, as many people do, those are the things that you become very fond of and that you come to relish, and you really enjoy the sophistication, I guess, of the game, and the fact that you can go to a summit and afterwards, or in the midst of it, or even a council meeting, you have journalists from all different places kind of coming together, just trying to work out what happened. And you have so many different interpretations based on, was this, whether you're looking at it through the lens of the institutions or on and on and on. And oftentimes, several of these interpretations of the truth are actually kind of valid at the same time. I found that incredibly interesting and satisfying and different, I guess, from things that I'd written about and covered before. And eventually you spend enough time that you notice sort of the new people coming into the press room, and you've reached this sort of tipping point where you are the one, sort of spewing the jargon, and the newcomers are looking somewhat puzzled. I guess for the last 2 years, I've been an editor at the FT, so I'm now on the other side of the table, so to speak, which I think has probably helped inform my views as to what works or what makes for good EU journalism, and probably a lot of things. But I think one thing that sort of stands out to me is the ability of somebody to really master the subject, to do all the legwork, to really understand it in all of its complexity, and then to be able to distill it and write it in a fairly straightforward way, often with some interpretation that makes it interesting and useful, that kind of captures the essence of it. And I think it's a fairly, well, having now, being in my position as I am now and reading all the copy that comes in, it's a rare ability that not a lot of journalists have. I think obviously Anton is very good at this. My colleague Peter Spiegel, Stephen Castle, Stephen Fiddler, Ian Trainer, a number of others. But it's not hiding behind the jargon, which I think is often a tendency when you're new or you're a younger journalist, and sort of striving to appear as though you know what's going on. And on the other hand, it's not sort of being too casual and being simplistic. So I think, I guess, given by the sort of number of people that I mentioned, the number of people that we're reading, there's a lot of talent, frankly, covering Brussels. I suppose the other observation that I would make is that Anton had sort of pointed out, the difficulty of calling the news desk and trying to sell a story or get an editor interested in a story about often kind of bland figures or people that simply the names don't travel, at least not outside of Brussels. I think the interest in Brussels has grown enormously. I suppose for bad reasons. The Euro crisis, first of all, I think the stakes were a lot higher than a lot of the other things that we spend our time tracking down in Brussels, and the drama is much clearer. And I think the readership of our stories all over the world certainly bears that out, that people are interested in Brussels that probably never really had been before, interested in European integration, interested in the euro. Will it survive? Was it a good idea? Was its creation flawed? On and on. And we have people reading these stories in San Francisco, New York, elsewhere, people that are sort of beyond our natural pool for EU news. And I think now, with the migration crisis, unfortunately, that's even more so the case. I think the stakes are ever higher. The story is even more tangible and apparent to people. So I will leave it there.
Well, I'm the broadcaster on the panel, so there's a lot of what I have to say that I think Mark has already articulated. And I in my career, have done what is known as a reverse Mardell, which was starting off in the States. That sounds rude, you're quite right. Started off in Washington, then went to Brussels, and now I'm in the Westminster press pack. So I'm seeing it from the other way around. But all of the complexities that Anton and Josh have been talking about, now try to imagine boiling all of that down into a 90-second television piece, which is normally what you have, the time that you are allotted. Sky could be a little bit looser than say, the BBC when it comes to kind of timings, but you still have to be relatively tight. You've got to have relatively good picture to illustrate it, which again is a massive issue. But also you've got to get the news desk interested, and this is very tough when you haven't got big personalities, when you haven't got great picture, and you've got something of immense complexity. And I think Josh is absolutely right when he's talking about, how we're so attracted to binary propositions, people taking one position, somebody else taking another and fighting each other. When you're dealing with a consensus body, they're doing everything they can to try and minimize those, so therefore you have less to report. But I will hold up my hand and say that I don't think we do a great job in the British broadcast world in explaining Europe. And there are a number of reasons for this. Ones that I've just pointed out, which are kind of systemic. But also the fact that there is, in every newsroom, certainly that I'm aware of, a battle between the domestic political politicians, the lobby journalists that come out for the summits, and the ones that actually know what they're talking about when it comes to some of the ones who actually live and are based in Brussels. And we have had, I wouldn't say that I would never come to blows with Adam because he's a lot bigger than I am, but we had disagreements where he saw it from a British political point of view, and I was saying, but we do actually need to explain that actually the more interesting element of this is to do with Merkel and Renzi or whatever. And that tension, when you consider it, you have Adam, who, as I say, is a lot bigger than me, but also he has a much bigger team. He has 5 or 6 producers. He's got 7 or 8, Westminster correspondents, and they take up a lot more airtime on Sky than the Brussels team, which was me, a cameraman, and a producer. And we had the foreign desk who were commissioning us, and then the political Millbank desk that was commissioning Adam or whichever political correspondent was out there at the time. And I think because of that structure, we did and we have followed the lobby line far too much. And I think that it's a big danger at the moment because the politicians are obviously trying to control the message. There are so many issues to talk about. Language, I think, is a huge one. I think not knowing a language is a big problem. My French was terrible. It got a lot better when I was out there. But still, the British press group started this kind of huddle thing, so the presswoman would come out or pressman would come out and everybody would gather around. All the other countries now do it pretty much at summits. And to know someone who's in that huddle for the other countries and then to be able to talk about it afterwards, you started to get an idea of what was coming together at the summit, and you could tell much better stories in your lives. But if you could just get a little bit of language and just get in there and kind of hear the sense of what they're saying, it does help. So I've taken some of the blame. Broadcasters are to blame. We're not always finding the best ways of telling the story and forcing it on air. And I'll hold my hand up to that. But I don't think the EU helps at all either. The summits are fairly depressing to cover, that we are in this enormous atrium, which you've seen on television, filled with hundreds of journalists, while everything else is happening in a room. I'm not suggesting that we should be in there to listen to, kind of everything that's been, agreed beforehand, but we're playing along with the artifice of this, that we know that there's a system of Sherpas and diplomacy that kind of happens before, and these are pretty much, it's window dressing really, but we play along with it, and we take the family photo, and, we follow the choreography, which is pretty similar to every summit. And the EU is choreographing it to such an extent that sometimes it takes away the interesting stuff for us to be able to report on. They smooth it so much that often it's a bit vaporous. It's a bit difficult to get at. I don't think it sells itself very well, the EU, but also, there are inherent problems within it, that it is just an enormous structure. It's 3-dimensional chess. It is difficult to report the process of legislation when things pop up in the Commission and then disappear for what seems like months, sometimes years, and then they pop up again at the other end, and the piece of law may have changed dramatically, but you're kind of held away a lot of the time from the process. What I think is the positive thing, not only the fact that everybody has mentioned here that now with the referendum it is focusing minds in the UK, and not just the minds of people who are going to be voting the referendum, but also our editors' minds, which as working journalists is important. But the technology is helping. I'm not totally restricted to a television package now to be able to tell a story, and we have explainers on how the institutions work, how they fit together, the importance of the treaties. That's all kind of there and sitting on our website that we can refer back to on air, which we do a lot more. So you can now see there's kind of a hinterland of our journalism available for people to log in and look at, which is important. And also there's an interactive element now where we get tweets tweeted at us, often not always complimentary, but sometimes there are people asking questions. I don't understand the difference in the Council and the Council of Europe. Can you explain it to me? And you could send back kind of a few words in the best way you can to them to try to explain it. And I think that there's a level of access to us, the reporters, which I think technology is now improving. I hope that's the case anyway. I mean, the last thing I would say, that the other problem, and I would point out that Sky still has our bureau. ITN has now pulled out of Brussels entirely. So, kind of Channel 4, Channel 5, the ITV News have no presence permanently in Brussels. But one of the other problems with broadcasters is they tend to rotate you around, so you don't go native, I suppose is the thinking behind it. You stay British. But just when I was starting to understand the EU, like that bit at the end of the Matrix film, where he sees all the code. I just got that moment, and then I was yanked back to the UK. But now I'm reporting on the referendum, and hopefully I can bring some of what I learned from Brussels to my current job.
The great joy about covering Brussels is that it's sort of anarchic, really, compared to Westminster, in that, your sources of information are in that Downing Street have a grid through which all government announcements are sort of processed in a fairly sort of disciplined way. You have a counterpart for the opposition normally in sort of normal times. And so to have, 28 governments, councils, the Commission, all sort of, briefing, and, a city in which paperwork and documents are sort of traded like cigarettes in prison, is a delightful sort of, for a journalist, a delightful change in culture, for a political culture where, leaking information is now, I think, a disciplinary offence, if not imprisonable, in Whitehall. Is tremendously liberating and great fun, and it's a great sort of detective story each day, sort of piecing together what's going on. The culture shock, I guess, is something that comes down to sort of fairly fundamental about what how your political culture works and what you think the job of newspapers is. And isn't that before we begin a debate about how Eurosceptic is the British press, is an examination of the fact that the British press is notably sceptic. It's uncompromising about the conduct of the NHS or the police or the leadership of the army or Whitehall. And so, I think it's no great surprise that the popular mid-market press, shall we say, is robust in its coverage of decision-making at a European level, because it is no different to the standard with which you would approach decision-making in this country. And, and that isn't necessarily something that is shared throughout the different newspapers in Europe. And so sometimes I do wonder if for example, within the Commission press room, whether the approach to the British newspapers is the Euroscepticism is confused, for example, with scepticism towards institutions, full stop. I guess within that, there is, within British politics, a very high strain of accountability culture, in that, I guess born of the fact that you have an adversarial system. Decisions by and large aren't cooked up in committees. The idea is that you present a policy on the floor of the House, and you win the argument and you win the election, and then you deliver the policy, and if you don't deliver it, you bear the consequences. That idea of having sort of one individual who carries a policy through is sort of antithetical, I guess, to the European system, which is one based on compromise, and compromise being a virtue, I guess. The tension that I'm interested in is that actually, as we have an increasingly self-styled political commission, one that is sort of being more adventurous perhaps in its right of initiation of legislation, whether the culture of accountability that you might expect to place upon the commission as it does that is catching up with the commission's expectation of the accountability on which it is placed. I wonder if there is a gap sometimes between the ambition and the responsibility. I guess the example I would draw on that would be the way in which the press cover the relocation policy, which is a classic example of a policy that has failed. I think the British press has been uniquely robust in the way that it's approached what has objectively been a policy failure. In terms of the complicated nature of the decision-making process going through council, I do sometimes wonder if that is used as a sort of a shield, perhaps, for what what should be about having a greater level of scrutiny upon individual decision-makers within the Commission. A further sort of cultural gap that I notice is that obviously when you're in Fleet Street operating in Westminster, you sort of become quite complacent about the fact that you're often at the front of the queue when it comes to information. You sort of expect the Downing Street have an obligation to brief you if you're the Daily Telegraph or the Times on the campaign trail. That isn't sort of necessarily shared within the Berlaymont. You have papers from 28 countries, and so you sort of have to accept, or quite quickly becomes apparent that you cannot expect always to be sort of at the front of the queue for this sort of the one-on-one briefings on policy exclusives, which is something that takes time getting used to, and you sort of have to stand your ground occasionally.